Hi, William. Are you there?
Hey, good afternoon.
Hi, how are you?
Very
Evening.
good. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining.
Pleasure.
So, I don't do many lives, but when William proposed to do live, I thought it's a brilliant idea because he is the expert of Burgundy wines and he's the reviewer of the Wine Advocate. And he also has his own vineyard in Burgundy. So I think he can share really a lot of things, interesting things with us. And really happy to have you here, William.
Well, delighted to be here. Thank you.
And maybe we can even take some questions at the end, would be fun.
Oh, certainly. No, I agree.
Yeah. So they say that all the roads lead to Burgundy. Why is that?
Well, I think it reflects the fact that not only are the wines of Burgundy sort of remarkably just appealing as beverages, that this is remarkably sensuous, exciting, thrilling drinks, but also it's a region that's sort of unparalleled in its complexity. Really, every tiny parcel of vineyard is classified and named and distinguished, and then those vineyards themselves are owned by a lot of different producers. So you can really spend a whole lifetime, your whole wine journey, as it were, getting to grips with some of that, with that complexity. Beyond that, I think the even bigger thing that we've seen in the last decade is that this sort of animating philosophy of Burgundy, which is this notion of terroir, that it's the site, the details, the specifics of the site that shape the way the wine tastes. That philosophy has been globalized, if you like. Pretty much, Bordeaux Chateau that used to talk about the Chateau, the style, or Champagne houses used to talk about the style, or Californian winemakers used to talk about the grape variety or the brand. Now everybody's talking about terroir. It's the big, it's the big concept, and that has been shared around the whole world from Burgundy. And so I think logically that leads everybody back to the source when they get deeper into wine.
And in Burgundy, it's all about terroirs. Tell us more about Burgundy and tell us just like the beginner stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to remember it's a very big region, but everybody tends to fixate on the heart of Burgundy, which is this 50-mile long southeast-facing limestone escarpment called the Côte d'Or. So from just south of Dijon to 20 miles south of Beaune, basically. You can drive the length of it in an hour and a half, and that's where the most expensive wines come from. There's a lot of history there, and that's where the vast majority of anything classified as Grand Cru, comes from it. In fact, Burgundy is this much bigger region, stretching from Chablis and Irancy in the north, all the way down to the Mâconnais, so almost as far as Lyon, practically, or to the Beaujolais. So it's this very big region. I think it's we talk a lot about how expensive Burgundy is, and the top wines are. I mean, I review wines every year that are several thousand. I mean, not even over 10,000 euros a bottle on the market, which is crazy for most people. But there are also vast realms of wine in places like the Mâconnais or Chablis that are very reasonably priced. So I think one thing I would say is just it's important to take a step back and not just fixate on the Côte d'Or, even though it's very picturesque. It's a lovely place to be, and I live part of the year in Beaune, as I think you know. So I am certainly alive to its charms as well.
So where is your vineyard, William?
So I make some wine from a vineyard in Chambon-Musigny, and now from another in Gevrey-Chambertin, and also a little bit of wine from Beaune, just outside, where my house is. So. Just
Amazing.
tiny, it's four or five barrels so far, but I'd like to make more. But I never imagined I'd be making any, so it's already a very good start.
I hope to try it one day.
Oh, you must, yeah.
And you are where now? In Texas, right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I spend the winter in the US these days. Yeah.
So you were mentioning that Burgundy wines are very diverse, and we talk about it a lot, as you said, because we pay much more attention about terroir nowadays, but also Burgundy have some of the most expensive wines. What are the most expensive? Can you mention some of them?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most expensive absolutely are those from Domaine Leroy, produced by this. I think she's maybe 83 now. Perhaps it's not polite to say. Valérie Leroy, who used to be co-director of Domaine Leroy Conti, pioneer of biodynamics. Very innovative farming methods, very very low yields. Just incredible wines that, in many ways, though, they're cutting edge, but they're also her inspiration. She always says to me is that. She's inspired by the 1955 Chambertin she made when she was an intern at another winery in 1955. I think she was 18 or so. So in some ways, the style of the wines is also, back to the future. She's looking at those wines before modern methods, chemical farming, all the things that sort of caused Burgundy problems in the, especially late 60s, 1970s, 1980s. She's trying to wind back the clock a bit, as well as doing things that are very innovative. So yeah, those are incredibly expensive, and I think the only way is up. People often say to me, prices are too high for a lot of the wines I used to buy. I'm going to stop and maybe it'll calm down, but that's not going to happen. We're talking about such small production. The smallest cuvee I taste in Burgundy every year is only 80 liters of wine. Whereas I think something like Dom Pérignon or Champagne is more like 8 million bottles, and Chateau Lafite is more like 400,000 bottles, and then we're talking about 80 liters. You don't need many people to want to buy that wine for it to become very expensive, just for the forces of supply and demand. So.
Yeah, but it doesn't mean that there are no gems like
absolutely not.
For much more affordable budget.
One thing I wanted to ask you, though, is, wine, we talk about a little bit about terroir in the wine world. I guess you probably see similar emphases coming in food scene in the last, decade or so. People talking a lot about provenance of ingredients and, really reconnecting with the source. And I think it's just the same, we're very much immersed in a similar situation.
Exactly. Maybe 20 years ago, it was for chefs to say that we are cooking from local seasonal ingredients was something to differentiate. Nowadays, it's completely normal, and this is what we expect from the chefs.
Yeah.
Whether they are fine dining chefs or bistro chefs.
Yeah, no, and it makes so much sense.
Exactly. So Burgundy is a very complex region. Are there any shortcuts? And details about that, if there are.
No, it's a good question. Again, that's a question people often ask. Unfortunately, there are no shortcuts, and that's one of the reasons why people get captivated by Burgundy, is because, there are always surprises. Sometimes there are bad surprises, in fairness, sometimes you have a confluence of a great producer, a great vintage, a great vineyard, and the wine isn't good. It can be maddening and frustrating as a region too, probably more so than other vintage, other regions that are perhaps a bit more regular, even if the highs are maybe not so high. But I would say that there's one useful rule, at least, to keep in mind, which is, Burgundy is very stratified by the appellation system, which classifies in a hierarchy every vineyard in the region, and people often sort of think, well, then I have to find the best wine, I need to be drinking Grand Cru Burgundy. But in fact, the best heuristic for finding good bottles, I think, is always look for the best producer. The best producer, even if it's a humble wine, will, chances are, be making a more interesting product than a famous name that's just trading off the appellation of the famous vineyard and not putting in the work. Because you walk through the vineyards in Burgundy on a map, it looks like they're all the same, and this guy's parcel of Chambertin is next to the other guy's parcel of Chambertin, so they should be the same, right? But the differences in the way the vineyards are cultivated are absolutely flagrant. Different genetic strains of Pinot Noir, different yields, small berries versus fat berries, and those things influence the character of the wine hugely. So, and then of course there's the winemaking on top of that. So there are a lot of opportunities for human element to either raise the level of the wine if it's from a humble place, or to waste the potential of a really great vineyard. So I'd say producer. I think I'm not the first person to say it. People have been saying it for decades, but that's the best way. And it's you can put confidence in the top producers, and you see their names on a wine list. It's normally a good sign. Forget about the vintage, forget about the vineyard to some extent.
Yeah. So how would you identify the sweet spots on a wine list when you are in a restaurant?
Well, yeah, and I think if certainly if you see any producers' names you recognize, that's absolutely a great a great thing. You know, the other thing to look for is, especially in some of the Michelin-starred restaurants in France that have these cellars for quite a long time. You know, there are stages now that the way Burgundy prices are accelerating in the market is such that some of these restaurants, the prices that looked very expensive 5 years ago, and are now cheaper than retail. You know, and you can send it back if it's corked or whatever. Some of the relative values in restaurants now are the very expensive bottles. Paradoxically, if you're looking for something more, more affordable, more approachable, I think these days also, outside of a small number of restaurants, it's very rare to find older wines on the list, and there have been very few bad vintages in Burgundy since 2000. So I think it makes sense to sometimes just gravitate towards the older wines, because they'll be a bit more open and expressive. Burgundies can live for quite a long time if they're well made from good producers. And drinking right now 2018s or soon 2019s, they'll start showing up on wine lists. And those wines are just a bit, they're a bit tight and buttoned up after bottling. So I'd say look for. Don't fixate on the great vintage. Just go for whatever has a bit of maturity. Looks like it might be interesting.
So you mentioned some of the worst years for Burgundy. What were they?
Well, 2004 was tricky, especially for red wine, because there were the ladybugs. I can't think of anything comparable in the. I guess back in the food world a couple of years ago, there was an algal bloom in California that ruined the Dungeness crab crop, and it's a bit like that in the 2004 Burgundy, because there were these ladybugs that got on the grapes and imparted a bitter taste to the wines, which was quite extraordinary. But there was just an abundance of these bugs, so that was a very tricky vintage. And there was also a lot of rot and disease, but apart from 2004. It's tough to really think of a sort of really, really difficult vintage. You have to go back to 1998, and then in the decade of the 90s and the 80s, there were more often these vintages. But like Burgundy is definitely being impacted by climate change. That's clear. And so far, it's probably been a net positive for the wines of the region. We'll see.
Oh, really? That was one of my questions about climate change, actually, and how the climate change is affecting the Burgundy wines.
We're getting earlier and earlier harvests, and higher levels of sugar in the grapes. But you have to remember, back even a few years ago, it was very routine to have to add sugar to the wines of Burgundy when they're fermenting to increase the alcohol level. So instead, now people are not really needing to do that. We have natural alcohols that are a bit higher, sometimes a bit too high. So producers are really, I think the real challenge for producers is to adapt. There are going to be challenges to help the vineyards adapt, especially to drought, of course. But Pinot Noir is impressively drought resistant. Actually, it's more the rootstocks that they plant the Pinot Noir on that they need to change. But no, I'm pretty optimistic because 2020 was a very warm year. I mean, you remember if you were in Europe in 2020, it was a very warm summer, and the harvest was extremely early, and everybody, I was making my wine, and I thought. I picked the first parcel, in like August 16th or something like that, which is incredible for Pinot Noir in Burgundy. That hasn't happened since 1893 or 2003 as well. There's two big hot early vintages before, and I thought, well, this is going to be jam. It's going to be cooked, and the reality is it's not at all. The typical range of pH, the acidity level of wine is between pH 3 and pH 4. pH 4 being very low acid, rich, ripe, and pH 3 being, like champagne, something really, really tangy. And the pHs were incredibly healthy in 2020, much better than 2018 or 2019. So I think we see the vineyards maybe adapting, so I found it very encouraging. I was, and you have to remember, people have been growing Pinot Noir in Burgundy for, at this stage, the better part of 2,000 years.
Yeah, exactly.
And there have been some warm periods, like the medieval warm period in the 15th century. It was very hot, and they still had Pinot Noir. So, I'm kind of optimistic. If we do things right, I think I think we're not going to, we're still going to be drinking Pinot Noir from Burgundy 50 years from now. I hope so. Anyway.
I hope so too. It's my favorite wine.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
Mine too.
where do you sell your wine, William?
Well,
Do you
I
sell
haven't.
it at all?
Not so far.
Okay.
Yeah, not so far. I've only bottled one vintage because we do quite a long maturation in barrels. So that's and also I kind of don't want to distract too much from the fact that I'm reviewing wines. I don't want people to think, well, he's spending more time making wine than reviewing it. But it does teach me a lot. I mean, I guess I'm sure you love to cook, and it's the same thing.
Yes,
You learn so much about about the technicalities, about the a real appreciation of the work that goes into making great wine, which is I don't know. It's easy for me. I come in and I in 5 minutes, I taste somebody's wine and I assess the work which has taken them. If you think the pruning of the vine takes, that's a year's work because you're thinking about the year ahead when you're doing this year's work, and then maybe 2 years of aging in the cellar of the wine and it's bottled. I mean, that's 3 years of work that I professionally assess and score and review these wines very rapidly. And it's important to have some sort of humility when you're doing that because.
Absolutely.
So.
It's really wonderful, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, we're both very lucky, I think, we have pretty fun professions.
I couldn't agree more with you. And I've been seeing some questions from the viewers, but I can't keep track of them because they just disappear very quickly. So if you see any question that you would like to answer, maybe you can answer.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Certainly.
I think there was one question about half bottles of wine. If it's something in the beginning, but I can't really see where.
Well, maybe somebody was asking about if they age as well as full bottles or something like that.
Yeah, maybe.
Sometimes, yeah. Sometimes they, I mean, it's funny. People always say that half bottles should age faster than regular bottles, and I think in principle that's true. Because the volume of wine is smaller. But in fact, I've had half bottles of wine from the 1930s that were still drinkable. So they can be surprising.
Does it really affect the size of the bottle? Because could we? Okay, one more question.
It was a joke. It was somebody saying that since the wines are so expensive, should we buy half bottles? Which is pretty good. Okay. There was one producer who I get on with very well who made such a tiny yield in 2020. I said to him he should have bought all of his barrels in half barrels because he had to cancel his order for barrels because he made so little wines. I said you should have taken them all in half size.
Yeah, what a great idea. Minibar bottles.
He didn't laugh.
Okay, I can imagine.
Yeah.
Does it really affect the wine? Half bottle wine, regular bottle, Magnum?
Oh yeah, absolutely. No, because if you think the aperture is the same, so the contact with the potential for oxygen transmission through the cork is the same, but the volume of wine increases. But I mean it squares. So. You have a much larger volume of wine in a Magnum relative to the capacity for oxygen, so they age much more slowly generally. And Magnums in many ways are the best size for really extended aging of wine. But of course the downside is if it's corked, you lose 2 bottles, not just one. So.
Yeah, of course.
So that's you're putting a lot of eggs in one basket when you start getting into sort of 3 to 6 liter bottles, and I don't know. I have some in my cellar, but I don't find much occasion to open 6 liter bottles. Maybe I need to make more friends.
Yeah, well, who is the next
PYCM? Oh, so he's a question about Pierre-Yves Collin-Moret, a very famous white wine producer in Burgundy. So that's he makes wine in quite a sort of flinty, racy, precise style. It's quite long-lived, ages nicely. I don't know. I think it's an interesting question if anyone's sort of really emulating that style on a similar sort of level. I wouldn't say, I'd say that, and there are some micro producers who are doing sort of extended aging of the white wines and things like that who are very good, like L'Ami Caillard, but they're harder to find than Pierre-Yves Collin-Moret's wines because he makes quite a bit of wine. So I don't know, that it's tough. People often ask questions like, who's the next Cocherie, or who's the next Armand Rousseau, or these sort of, who's going to take over the mantle of these very famous producers. But one of the fun things about Burgundy is how, because there's everything is so personal. All the decisions can be made by one woman, man, picking day. There are so many choices you make, so you can really express. You can have wines that really express the personality of an individual, and for that reason, it's very unusual, really, to find wines that are replicas of other wines. And that's one of the interesting things about Burgundy. I hope long may it stay that way. The danger is everything gets more expensive. You have consulting winemakers who people they want a feeling of security, so they hire a consultant. And then wines can start tasting a bit more the same.
Yeah. What do you think of Lucien Lamoine?
Lucien Lamoine, I like the wines. This is a guy called Mounier who buys wine. He buys finished wine and then does the élevage, the maturation in barrels. It takes a lot of the lees, a lot of the yeast cells, the sort of solid material on the bottom of the barrel that he uses to enrich the wines, and then uses quite a lot of new oak and ages the wine a long time. They can be a bit oaky and a bit dramatic out of the gates, the Lucien Lamoine wines, but my experience is they age, really pretty well, and I think he's one of the better micro negociant producers, in Burgundy.
So. We have a few more questions that are very interesting. I don't know how to keep track of them, so I just take a picture of them.
No, and some of them are quite technical.
Sense, but sorry?
Some of them are quite technical. I saw we just got one about whole cluster fermentation. So that is that's a super technical aspect of winemaking. Whether do you destem the red grapes when you make the wine, or do you leave them intact on the stems? Increasingly, people are leaving them on the stems, and when they're left intact on the stems, you can get this sort of a fermentation that starts without oxygen inside the berries. Can make very sort of fruity, floral aromas in the wine. And the stems impart a taste as well. So it's definitely becoming much more fashionable in Burgundy, and Domaine de la Rome et Conti do a lot of that. They're the most famous producer, like Dujac does a lot of that as well. So it's an interesting technique, but it gives a very strong signature to the wines.
So can you comment regarding acid in 2020? Can you comment on influence of weather versus winemaking?
Well, I think one of the key things, there have been some very hot vintages in the past, right? Like 1990 was very warm, 2003 is super warm, extreme. In fact, the 1990 heat wave, I think, killed more people than the first wave of COVID in France. So many old people died. It was really terrible experience for a lot of people. And, the result were these wines that were very sort of roasted in character. Very rich, very, like prune aromas, not fresh, not lively, not dynamic, not the sort of thing, like a sauce that's too heavy or whatever. And everyone thought this is just because of the weather. And obviously, it's a product of the weather, but it's also a product of how producers responded to the weather. So if you pick in the midday sun and your grapes are very warm, and then you leave them in the courtyard of your winery while you're having lunch in the sun, they start to get damaged and get too hot and oxidize. The fermentations can get complicated. You can get volatile acidity. There can be a lot of problems. Whereas if you pick very early in the morning and you put the grapes then in a refrigerated truck and you take them back to your winery and you're very careful with them, you can mitigate a lot of these things. Then similarly, there are things you can do when you're making the wine, maturing the wine to keep the flavors fresh. So I think today, if you take a vintage like 2003, if it were to come along again, and the most similar we've probably had recently is 2018, which combines some of the characteristics of 2003, even though it's not as extreme. Some people manage to make very fresh tasting wines, brilliant wines, and it makes you wonder, do you have to have these sort of overripe characteristics, oxidative characteristics in wines from hot vintages? Well, I think not, but we have to adapt. And it's much harder to make great wine in a year like that because, you really need to know what you're doing and be very attentive and have the equipment too, have the investment. So,
how many years you've been making wine, William?
Oh, well, I started in 2017 in California, so I make a bit of white
Okay,
wine in California, and then 2018 was my first vintage in Burgundy. So my first
amazing.
vintage in Burgundy was this with this very extreme
Congratulations.
hot year. Thank you. That's an interesting question. Diurnal variation in temperature can affect the acidity that markedly. That's a that's a very technical question indeed. So he's asking if the difference between nighttime and daytime temperatures, if that's extreme, do you have more
Yeah,
or less acidity? Uh, it's complicated. In short, if you have very cold nighttime temperatures, it actually stops the vine's metabolism. The vine completely shuts down, and so acidity doesn't get metabolized by the vine, so it can indeed preserve acidity. Equally, though, you don't get any maturation of the flavors. So it's almost as if you press the pause button during the night and nothing happens in the vine because the grapes
yeah,
don't ripen either. So you keep acidity, yes, but you also don't get flavor maturation. So often wines that come from regions with those sort of characteristics, like mountain vineyards, where there's an intense swing between nighttime and daytime temperatures, often they will be both quite acid and quite tannic. So, sorry, but that's a very technical question.
yeah. Only you can answer it. I
Oh.
couldn't. What is your favorite wine, Aiste? It definitely is Burgundy, Pinot Noir, anything Pinot Noir. And I'll ask another question to William. So, as a regular consumer, what is the soft spot for pricing for Burgundy? Like, everyday drinking. It's
Yeah.
not that you should be drinking every day, but you know.
Well, I think one thing to remember also is it's going to be very different depending on the market you're in. But in Europe,
Yeah.
you can still drink Burgundy quite affordably. In the US, especially now with the 25% tariffs, and then also
Yeah.
a market that tends to sort of try to price the wines at the maximum people will pay rather than hand on a standard margin. It's tough. In
Yeah.
mainland China, there's 100% tax on all imported wine. But I'd say for 25 to 35 euros, you can get still some really very good wines. But you have to look for less famous appellations. You have to be a bit more adventurous. You're not going to be able to drink Vin Romanée from a top producer for that price. But you can drink sublime wines from Rouy or Irancy or wherever. A lot of places. So.
And you have touched the topic of American politics and tariffs. Did it
Yeah.
change?
Oh no! I mean, I think
Did it affect on Burgundy exports at all, or?
Yeah. Oh, for sure. And I'm seeing. I would say the sort of top 50 domains, it hasn't impacted. Those are domains where maybe if they had 10 buyers for each bottle wanting to buy each bottle, they now have 7. So it's not. They still have plenty of people. They still have more demand than they have wine. But for a lot of other producers, people who are a bit less famous, I think it's been very hard because the US is the biggest export market for the wines of Burgundy. Absolutely. And I keep seeing sort of offers from people who are sort of trying to sell 1,000 bottles of this, 1,200 bottles of this. So the wines are circulating. Right now, we haven't really seen prices fall in the market, which is interesting. They aren't sort of closeout sales, but I think that may come for some wines in the next year or two, especially with the restaurant trade suffering as much as it is, and especially in France, because it's been terrible.
Yeah. Thoughts on oak treatment, preferable preferences for your taste?
Oh, I mean, we talked about the Loire wines. Those are all 100% new oak. A lot of the best wines in Burgundy have 100% new oak. But the best wines also, you can't taste it. It doesn't dominate the wine. And there's the old saying is there's no wine that's over oak. They're just wines that are under wine. You need to have substance to the wine to be able to sort of soak up the oak. But I think a lot of it also comes down to the choice of barrels. It's one of those things, it's a real rabbit hole you could get down between which forest in France or other countries also. Was the tree growing by the road? If it was growing by the road, it would have had more light, so the grain will be wider. And if it was in the middle of the forest, it will have tighter grain. All these things influence how the barrel will make the wine taste. Then how long you season it. There are infinity of variables, and this is something I see very acutely making my own wine. It's very difficult to get the perfect barrel, but when you do, the effect is almost imperceptible in the wine. It's quite interesting. You know, so you can have sometimes some of the oakiest, most oaky tasting wines I tasted didn't even have new barrels. They just had bad quality barrels that have been used several times, but they still gave a strong taste to the wine. It's interesting.
So we have more questions. I also see one of my favorite chefs, Christian Lesquer, is here.
Oh, wow.
Emmanuel
Fantastic.
Renaud is there as well.
Excellent.
Very happy to have you here, chefs. Do you think Burgundy INAO should let plant other grape types?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe on the white. So to back up for everybody, the INAO regulate which grape varieties can be planted to entitle a wine to its appellation. And for red, that's Pinot Noir for almost all of Burgundy. And then for white, it's Chardonnay for almost all of Burgundy. I think, you know, Pinot Noir is a fabulous grape, and it's, as I mentioned, surprisingly adaptable to climate change, to warmer climates, to cooler climates. It's very genetically mutable as well, so a lot of different strains of Pinot Noir, some that could ripen maybe 3 weeks before another. So in this sort of warmer climate, I think with Pinot Noir we can do a lot. We can select kinds of Pinot Noir that will ripen a bit later, that are drought resistant, and so on. The white side of things is a bit harder, because white winemaking in Burgundy is more recent historically. You know, we're talking about a couple of maybe 200 years for Chardonnay. Before that, almost everything was red. And people used to plant a lot of other grapes in with the Chardonnay. They used to plant a bit of Aligoté, which is a much more high acid grape. They used to plant a bit of Pinot Blanc. And when the appellation laws were made in the 1930s, a lot of that was outlawed. And over time, people, when they replanted, they just went 100% Chardonnay. Now, I think in this warmer climate, it would be very interesting to have, you know, a bit of Aligoté in with your Chardonnay, maybe 5% for a bit more acidity. You know, a bit of Pinot Blanc, which also ripens more slowly, 10% of that, and suddenly your Chardonnay will be much more dynamic and fresh, while retaining the sort of texture and generosity of the grape. So yeah, no, I agree. I would stick with Pinot Noir for red 100% forever and ever. But for on the white side of the ledger, it could be interesting if there was a little bit more flexibility in the system. You know, a little bit more adaptation. But that would be very difficult. That will take a long time. I mean, anything in France with the appellation systems takes decades to achieve. You know.
Are you excited by the growing popularity of Grower Champagne? Any specific producers you enjoy?
Oh yeah, no. So I review champagne as well, not just Burgundy. So absolutely, yeah. I love wines from, especially a bit like in Burgundy. I try to really champion producers who are working in less famous appellations, but doing fabulous work in the vineyard. You know, working with great grapes, and then really thoughtful winemaking. And it's the same in Champagne. There are producers in places that just farming villages that no one had heard of, who are coming out of nowhere and making magical wines. You know, people like Cédric Bouchard, Ulysse Collin, and you can see these on wine lists all over Europe, and they're just, you know, magical. I think they're doing more and more. I think they're doing a better job than a lot of the Grand Marque, a lot of the big houses of Champagne. Because you know, those guys are producing millions of bottles, and it's hard to make millions of bottles with the same level of attention to detail that you can devote to small production.
One more question: which producers in Beaujolais are pushing things forward and thrill you?
That's interesting. I mean, so Beaujolais, I also review Beaujolais, and it's kind of it's very different from the other regions I review, because Beaujolais is really driven by the natural wine scene. So this sort of approach to winemaking without using sulfur or using very little, you know, with really trying to touch the grapes as little as possible and bottle them without any intervention. So yeah, that's such a big thing in Beaujolais, but it's not really much of a movement in the rest of Burgundy or in Champagne. So for me, it's very complicated to review, because, you know, those wines age very differently. Often they can be a bit more wild. Yeah, they can have sort of more savory dimensions. Sometimes they can have, you know, low-level flaws like volatile acidity, or, you know, mousiness, or these sort of technical things that a lot of, you know, winemakers would consider imperfections. But I try to do justice to that, you know, because I think you can't come to a wine that's trying to do one thing and fault it for not doing another thing. You know, you have to, I think, to an extent, judge the wine according to the standards it sets for itself. So no, but there are a lot of producers down there. I love Jean Foyard always. You know, Jean Foyard in Morgon. A very consistent producer. Wine's always very clean and perfumed and drinkable. And you know, I think for me, it's a sort of obvious name, but it's one that I really appreciate.
What do you think of natural wines?
Yeah, I mean, this is the big question. You know, this is the big question.
Yeah, that's why I'm asking you this question. I have my opinion, but I don't know. I'm not an expert.
You know, it's funny that I was a historian by training before.
I know, and I will ask another question that I want to tell you that I would love you to tell the story about.
And well, I'm looking forward to it. But no, so one. It's interesting to step back and look what's the history of the phrase vin nature, natural wine in French. Yeah. And it started out in the 19th century. Okay, it's been going on for a long time. Back then it meant wine that was not adulterated, in the same way that you'd say, you know, yaourt nature for yogurt that doesn't have a flavor, you know, hasn't been flavored. Yeah. It's because back then people were adding all sorts of things to wines to give them different tastes. You know, they would add port, they would add brandy, they would add lime blossom to white wine, so they would add orris root, which is in perfumery, they use it for a violet aroma, they would add that to red Bordeaux, things like that. So they meant unadulterated wines. They don't mean natural wines. So the movement has sort of changed in the last 30 years when it was translated into English as natural wine, whereas it, you know, originally the origins of the concept was something quite different. You know, I think sometimes the wine stuff could be fabulous from the top producers, and it's really all been reduced to this sort of question of do you add a bit of sulfur dioxide to your wine or not? You know, and people sort of say that sulfur is an allergen. Well, yes, but you know, if you eat a dried apricot that contains a lot more sulfites than a bottle of wine. The reality is the great producers, whether they're making natural wines, so-called, or you know, conventional wines, do a lot of the same things. You know, they're great farmers. They're very attentive to the quality of the fruit. They sort rigorously, and they keep their yields reasonable. You know, and then they take care of their wines in the cellar. And if why it seems a little arbitrary to me sometimes that, say, a producer like Noir, who uses some sulfur, but apart from that, everything is organic. Everything is, you know, done by hand. I mean, you couldn't get more natural. But those wines are not considered natural wines, you know. Yeah. So sometimes it seems to me rather arbitrary. I kind of try to avoid some of the more heated debates about it, because it becomes this very acrimonious, contentious subject. Do you like it or don't you? I have some wines in my cellar that would be called natural wines for sure. Yeah.
So whoever is joining now, we are talking with the Burgundy expert and wine advocate reviewer, William Kelley. Sorry.
No worries.
It's late here in Milan, you know.
Yeah.
So, and I have one more question to you, William. So someone who loves Pinot Noir, as I do, and I'm sure many listeners love it too, what are the other great Pinot Noir producers around the world outside of Burgundy?
Well, you know, it's a grape that it absolutely originates from Burgundy, in that it's not a cross of anything. You know, so a grape like Cabernet Sauvignon is a cross of other grapes that hybrid, as it were, came into being after breeding. Pinot Noir is just Pinot Noir, and it comes from Burgundy, but it's absolutely been now planted all over the world pretty much. You know, I found some very exciting wines in Oregon. I really like Irie Vineyards. They were the first to plant Pinot Noir there. John Thomas also is a really sort of cult micro producer of Pinot Noir in Oregon, and I think Drouhin from Burgundy, who make wine in Oregon, do a great job. Then in California, you know, there are a lot of people, and in California you can really get every kind of style of Pinot Noir under the sun. You know, you can have these very rich, ripe, fleshy, oaky styles that have nothing to do with Burgundy at all, and they taste more like Rhone wines, you know. Or you can have people like producers like Domaine de la Côte down in Santa Barbara, who make this very perfumed, fragrant, elegant dynamic, succulent wines, because they're closer to the sea. You see, essentially, California, climate is determined by how much of an influence the Pacific Ocean has on your vineyard. So yeah, a lot of interesting stuff in California. Now somebody mentions there still Pinot Noir in England. I actually tasted a pretty good one the other day. So who knows? Then there's Southern Hemisphere, which I'm much less well informed about, honestly.
There's some really good sparkling wine in England.
Yeah, increasingly. I reviewed that too, in fact.
Yeah.
And then there's Swiss Pinot, which is getting pretty good too, and German. And, it's everywhere.
I love Swiss Pinot, actually.
Me too. It's very expensive, though.
It is very expensive.
Because the Swiss are so rich, I guess. But no, I review about 6,000 wines a year already just from Burgundy. So, probably before I became a critic, I was a bit better informed about other regions than I am now, because if you divide 6,000 by the number of days in a year, that's a lot of Burgundy to taste. It doesn't leave me with much time to taste other things.
Absolutely. Another good question. Are you excited by any producers expanding into new regions, Rouleau in Argentina, foray in Australia?
Yeah, I think it's fun. Especially what Rouleau is doing there is he's making also very affordable wines. And when you look at Rouleau Mercer Perrier, is now 1,600, 700 euros a bottle from Burgundy. You can get a Chardonnay made by the same man from Argentina that's 30 euros or less, and that's kind of exciting. It gives people a chance to taste some of the Burgundian sensibility, you could say, the winemaking style, the approach to farming, also the approach to ripeness of fruit, to size, for a more reasonable budget as well. Yeah. So no, I think it's great. Especially Southern Hemisphere makes sense because harvest is not at the same time. This is my problem making a bit of wine in California and Burgundy, is the harvests get closer and closer together. It's a nightmare to try to get back to Burgundy in time.
You also make wine in California, right?
Yeah, a little bit. But
Where
it's
about?
Chenin Blanc.
I'm sorry.
No, Chenin Blanc, in fact. Yeah, so
okay.
white. Yeah, thankfully it's white because it ripens sooner than the Pinot Noir in Burgundy normally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any more questions? So tell us. So Burgundy was the favorite wine of Napoleon. Tell us the story.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so he used to drink Chambertin. But it's kind of interesting for a number of reasons. That not only because he used to cut it with water. And now that's, if you look, the history of wine drinking, most of history people drank wine mixed with water. That's how the Romans and the Greeks and in antiquity drank wine. By the 18th century, people were doing that a bit differently. And Napoleon's foreign minister, Talleyrand, who was from a more aristocratic background, so Napoleon came from quite humble origins, relatively modest origins in Corsica. Talleyrand used to sneer at Napoleon for adding water to his Chambertin, but they even took the Chambertin with them to Russia, and of course then took some of it back when that didn't go so well. But Chambertin also back then, this is the first decade of the 19th century, it was fully 100 years before there was any appellation system. So back then a lot of vineyards around the vineyard today we call Chambertin were sold as Chambertin. So there was more, there was an element of a brand to it. And this process of refining the concept of terroir to say that this comes from exactly this row, this exact parcel, that's actually quite a recent thing and an evolution over time. It's not, people were always interested in where the wine came from in Burgundy, but legislating about where it has to come from, that's very new. So in the past, if it tasted like Chambertin, it came from the general vicinity of Chambertin, well, you would sell it as Chambertin. But so that's very different since Napoleon's day, that's for sure.
Do you still have some time to take some questions?
Absolutely, yeah, as long as you like.
Great. So another question, 1 second, I was looking at it. Can you give us some first-hand insight in the quality of the 2020 vintage in Burgundy?
Oh, sure, yeah. It was early, hot, dry. So those are the conditions in essence. And I think it's going to be an uneven vintage simply because it was so hot. You had to really pick at the right moment, because the vines were shutting down, the fruit was desiccating on the vine in some cases, and when the vine is shut down, when the leaves start to go yellow, it's not going to ripen anymore. You know, you just have to pick it. If not, you lose all your acidity, you have too much sugar, and then the grapes are very difficult to turn into wine when they're like that. So you're going to have it's going to be uneven, simply because not everyone got it right. But I think the good wines are going to be very good. As I mentioned, the pHs are low, the acidities are high. I only make red wine myself, so I have much more insight into that, having done it at this stage. I haven't really tasted other people's wines yet. But they're fresh, you know, they're quite deep, quite saturated in color. Quite a lot of tannin, more tannin than 19. You know, 19 Burgundy is a beautiful vintage. They're just amazingly sensual, supple, charming wines. Just very delicious. 20 has a bit more structure, a bit more grit, but it's still, I think, elegant and nicely balanced from what I've tasted. So, and alcohol is a bit lower than in 19 and in 18. So alcohol's more in the range of sort of, you know, 13, 13.5 instead of 14, 14.5. So that's good. Helps with the balance. And then people are very optimistic about the white wines. I haven't tasted any of the whites, and, you know, so that'll come this spring and this fall, if I can, if I manage to get back to France. But we're working on that.
I hope so. Fingers crossed. After the very hyped 2008 vintage, which vintages should we look out for in Champagne over the coming years? Any other
question.
legendary vintage in the making?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, 2008 absolutely has been very hyped. You're quite right. I like 2012 a lot. You know, 2012 is a bit more concentrated, a bit richer, a bit riper, but still a lot of acidity and structure. I think the wines will age very well. No, so I'm a big fan of 2012. I see somebody, Gareth, mentioned that, but that's right. You know, 2012 is terrific. I also like, but it was a more tricky year. But 2013, you know, 2013 is the last time in France, in Champagne and in Burgundy, we had a harvest in October. You know, and that used to be normal in the past. You know, especially in the 70s, 80s, 90s, in the sort of pre-extreme weather that we're starting to see in the last decade, it was very normal to harvest in October. Now it's much more normal to harvest in August. So if you like that sort of old-fashioned style from the cooler vintages with a lot of acidity and cut and sort of saline qualities, iodine, oyster shell sort of flavors, I think 2013 Champagne would be a vintage to stock up on, because I don't know when we're going to see a vintage like that again. Maybe this year, who knows? But
So, what are your other favorite wines apart of Pinot Noir and Burgundy?
I'm very boring. I had a pretty classic sort of English formation in wine, not through my family, but from a family friend who introduced me to wine, and so it was old Bordeaux, you know, from the 40s, 50s, 60s. So I still really love old Bordeaux, and have quite a lot of Bordeaux in my cellar. My cellar is about, I put about 3,000 bottles, and it's 60% Burgundy. So it's reasonably diverse, considering I live in Burgundy and I work in Burgundy. So I have a lot of old Bordeaux, and, you know, I love the wines of the Northern Rhone, producers in the Southern Rhone also, like Chateau Rayas.
Riesling?
And Riesling, absolutely, yeah. Especially Klaus-Peter Keller's dry Rieslings these days. And he ended up becoming a friend. He came to my tasting group when I was a student, and I love his wines. I found the dry Rieslings suddenly, I love the off-dry styles, but only when they're very old, when they're sort of 30, 40 years old. So dry Rieslings I can drink a bit younger and enjoy. And I have quite a lot of wine from California too, because I used to live in California. So.
Well, you're originally from Texas?
No, I'm from England. Yeah.
Oh, you're from England.
But my wife's from Texas, so that's why I spend a bit of time there. Yeah. There is wine made in Texas as well, but you know, but I won't comment on it.
At least I made you laugh. Okay. So just to come back to my first question about, and I guess will be wines in Lithuania. No wines in Lithuania. I don't know. I never tried.
I don't.
Oh, actually, there are, but I would not drink it. Actually, well, I'm not very patriotic as it is. Forget what I just said. Anyway, we started with this question was the statement that all the roads lead to Burgundy, and and it's usually more people learn about wines, they kind of convert.
I think
Do
so.
you
Yeah.
really think it's kind of the, I don't know, the holy grail of wine?
Yeah, I think that's certainly how that's certainly the journey that I followed.
Yeah.
And, you know, I mean, some people end up gravitating towards sort of more rich and powerful wines and different regions. So, you know, I certainly don't want to tell them they're wrong. Everybody should follow their own taste. But I think if you come to sort of privilege, aroma, texture, vibrancy in wine, it's very hard not to get seduced by Burgundy. And I think even the disappointments that sometimes it's a bit like, you know, rejection in a courtship or something. I said, it only makes you want to try harder to find the good bottles, you know. So that's certainly been my experience.
We'll take a few more questions, and I'll. What is the most humble Burgundy you love?
Oh, well, I have everything in my cellar. We talked a bit about the regions, but you know, just in terms of sort of the value of bottles, I think I have things between, you know, €8 and you know, 3, 4, 5,000 euros a bottle in my cellars. So I buy wine that you know, from all across the spectrum, and I love, you know, just as a very humble wine, is the regular white Rouilly from Vincent de Roy, Domaine de Roy Gential in Rouilly. And this is a wine that is, you can find for less than €20 on the market, and it ages for 20 years. You can drink it young, you can drink it old. It's made by a lovely man. Great viticulture, you know, organic farming essentially. So, you know, there's still plenty of wines like that. You know, I have quite a lot of modest wines from the Beaujolais in my cellar. You know, a guy like Daniel Bouland in the Beaujolais makes wine. I think it's €11 or something from the estate per bottle, and it's delicious. And it can age again. It can age for 15, 20 years if you want, or you can drink it young. And so I enjoy those sorts of wines a lot. You know? And one of the advantages of living in Burgundy is you have a bit of access to buy wines in the region that's much less expensive.
And
that's the thing.
Someone who has tasted some of the most amazing wines in the world, you still enjoy wines under €20?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I drink wine every night. You know, I have some colleagues who you know, they come back from a day of tasting and they want to drink a beer. But I want to open a bottle of wine. But what I do is I drink a lot of older wines. That's partly because I think I find older wines very interesting, more complex, more easier to digest. Also, the French call them digeste, and it's true. You feel a lot better the day after. But for me, tasting, you know, 40 young wines in a day is the ultimate aversion therapy for drinking young wine when I get home. So I often open, you know, 30, 40-year-old bottle in the evening, even if it's a modest wine. You know, it might be a Madiran or something like that. It doesn't have to be Chateau Lafite on Monday night by any means.
Chateau Lafite is for Friday night.
Or Saturday.
Exactly. What is the oldest wine you've had, and do you think did you really enjoy it?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that the oldest, you could say Madeira. I've had Madeiras, plenty of Madeiras from the 1810s, 1820s, but that's sort of cheating. I would say the oldest red wine that was not oxidized and was, you know, viable, drinkable, I've had and really loved is an 1895 Chateau Montrose.
Yeah.
Just still quite a deep red color, you know. Still quite structured. It's amazing how long-lived these things. But this is one of the nice things about, you know, wine that's sort of made in a traditional artisanal manner, has about as much lifespan as a human being, you know, I think typically. So, you know, a bottle of Gevrey Chambertin will last, you know, 60, 70 years in a cold cellar, well cared for, well made. And so, I mean, I've had Burgundies 100 years old. Those are the exception rather than the rule. You know, most wines don't live that long, but it's just like people. You know, there are some people who have this sort of extraordinary longevity and remain mentally acute and viable and, you know, interesting at that age. And then there are others who have a shorter, you know, shorter lifespan, unfortunately.
Yeah, very good comparison. I lost you a bit, but a very good comparison with people.
Oh, yeah. Oh, thanks. Oh. change
Do you
negatively
hear me? I
affecting the
think
Rhone.
internet is not very good.
I can hear you. Is it maybe
Sorry?
it's my connection? I can hear you.
Yeah, because I'm on 4G, so few more questions
Okay.
because so do you think climate change is negatively affecting Rhone?
You know, I think it certainly contributed to the wines becoming more extreme down my colleagues' toes. But you certainly see a lot more wines down there with alcohol producers. So, you know, I mean, to talk about climate change, to take us back to Burgundy, I always talk of an example of different wines from the and out. The real difference is what the wines were picked, you know, and the choice of the producers determines so much. That's the thing that I see making wines. You do have a lot of control, and so sort of, I think it's a pity for winemakers to just shrug their shoulders and say, you know, because of climate change, our wines are going to taste of jam. That's not necessary. So
Yeah.
I remain an optimist about most regions.
And let's take last question because connection is not that great anymore, and it's been 1 hour. Thank you so much, William,
Yeah, I know, my pleasure.
for being with us for 1 hour. So one more question. Yeah, internet is dying. I don't know on which side. Looking at the past few vintages in Burgundy 1519, which vintages will be among the early drinking ones? Which will take the longest to reach the drinking window peak?
I mean, 17 is the most common. 15 is probably going to be the one that takes the longest to mature, especially the red wines. 15 is a very structured, serious wines that are going to take some time. 18 is also serious and structured, rather richer than 15. And then 19 is a bit like 17 in the sense it's rather charming. So I'd say drink your 17s, then your 19s, maybe then your 18s, and then your 15s in that order. Does that make sense?
Fantastic. Thank you so much, William.
Thank you.
The Burgundy expert, the Burgundy reviewer at the Wine Advocate. And I'm really looking forward to try your wine one day.
Well, I hope it can be sooner rather than later. And thanks very much again for having me.
I really appreciate it.
Likewise.
Take care. Thank you
Great.
so much.
You
and
too.
Thanks everybody for joining. Take care. Thank you. Bye. Cheers. Bye. Thank you, everybody. How do I end this?